Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. So this is my sixth time doing this presentation or so in Fresno, various versions of this. This was originally a part of a day-long that we did in January. I'm now just going to do the first couple of hours of that and focus on what's called colloquially the life course framework. You might have heard that terminology used. This framework arose, and let me, background, I was going to, by way of telling you about the framework, tell you about myself, but let me just tell you, I'm co-founder of Forward Change Consulting. I'm based in Oakland, California. I founded it with my partner, Tia Martinez, who was here with me in January. And we do a lot of work as consultants on what we call social and economic equity. And one of the things we started working on about almost a decade ago was this emerging work in California focused on boys and men of color. We were looking at what the issues are in the state of California that create these disparate outcomes. And at the time, we knew there was something going on, but we didn't have a good grasp of A, the magnitude of it, and B, what was driving it, what the evidence was saying, why we were seeing disparate things with males versus females. That work got underway, a lot of things took off. We now have a standing select committee on boys and men of color in the state legislature as a consequence of that early work funded by the California Endowment and other folks. It took off, it kind of spread. This presentation emerged in its incubation at that time. Then the work took off nationally with some national funders getting involved on the work of boys and men of color. And then Obama subsequently got involved with My Brother's Keeper, and then the rest is kind of history. And so the epicenter was really California for this work. But even though I've come out here several times to do the presentation on boys and men of color, the presentation itself, the framework itself, is applicable to any disadvantaged population. So it's not just applicable to males. And you'll see that when we get into the framework proper. But the implications of gender for opportunity and for outcomes has become abundantly clear over the past 10 years, and I'm going to show you data and research that speaks to that. But we've always had an understanding that gender has been problematic for young women and girls for a long time. Now the evidence is more balanced, that it cuts both ways, just in different ways, different consequences for boys and girls. And one of the most damaging consequences that it turns out disadvantaged environments produce is bad educational or negative educational outcomes for boys. And I'm going to show you evidence that speaks to that. But the life course framework piece is really something that is a conceptual framework that you can utilize in your work in thinking about a variety of issues, and I think that's the big part of the reason why I'm doing this presentation today again. The first half of this presentation, and I'll try and not spend the lion's share of time or way too much time on this because I'm prone to do that, but I want to look at, explain our rationale for why there's a need to focus on gender, in this case, boys and men of color. And I'm basically going to articulate for you with 40 years arc of data, trend line, history, that there is essentially an intergenerational gender-specific cycle of disadvantage. And it's tied to some major shifts that we've seen over the past 40 years. Some of the most important are the decline in employment among males and the rise in mass incarceration. Those two are kind of twin pillars of what has become a intergenerational cycle. And then I'm going to present the life course framework for improving the lives of disadvantaged populations. That's the framework proper that can be applied to any disadvantaged population. And I'm going to use that framework to talk about how we interrupt this intergenerational cycle. And a big thing what the framework tries to do is it tries to connect big structural social changes to disparate patterns of human development. Two things that often don't meet conceptually in the same work. You know, we might focus our work on helping, say, young children develop skills or develop aptitudes or develop greater mental health that will help them cope with environments in which they live. But we talk about the structural things as kind of off out there. I'm trying to bridge that gap, bridge that divide so we can all see ourselves as part of the same work. So a policy advocate who's trying to end mass incarceration has a lot, as you'll see in this, in common with an early childhood educator. Two groups that often don't even see themselves in the same worlds, but in the reality of real life, their worlds intersect very closely. So there's a couple things I want you to keep in mind as I go through this presentation. I'm going to show you a fair amount of data that shows that girls are doing better than boys on a number of educational and other indicators. That's not the same thing as saying girls are doing well. In fact, oftentimes girls are doing terribly, it's just boys are doing significantly worse. The metaphor, the analogy I often use is that girls are dangerously treading water on some outcomes and boys are drowning on some outcomes. The lives of males and females are inextricably intertwined. So even if I talk about something that's really driving outcomes or affecting the lives of males, it doesn't imply that somehow women are in a vacuum or girls are in a vacuum insulated from that. In fact, one of the most interesting statistics relate to mass incarceration. So 90% of people who go to prison are men. But among African Americans, the highest group, the demographic group with the highest percentage of a family member incarcerated are black women. 45% of black women in America have a family member incarcerated. The number is actually lower for black men. Black men have fewer family members incarcerated. So even though this is an overwhelmingly male phenomenon, its footprint stands squarely in the life of African American women and girls. And girls aren't insulated from the realities that, daughters aren't insulated from the realities that affect the lives of their fathers and their brothers. And the last part is something that we've discovered mostly. There's just been a booming of research with very robust study designs, really large samples in the past year, that have validated this notion that boys and girls end up responding differently to disadvantaged families, disadvantaged schools, and disadvantaged neighborhoods, meaning their educational, behavioral, subsequent criminal justice, and employment outcomes start diverging very early when they come from these disadvantaged environments, and the gaps continue to grow over time. And we'll see some of the evidence that shows that the phenomenon is not limited to the United States, or at least I'll highlight that. And so what we've done as a consequence of recognizing that girls and boys are affected differently by context is take a closer look at the interventions that we lift up to respond to boys and girls and find that some work great for girls and not at all for boys, and some work great for boys and not at all for girls. We just never applied that lens before. And so now we're starting to realize that the list of things that's on the What Works clearinghouse or the social policy or whatever, wherever we're seeing these things, we find that they work for one group and not the other group based upon gender. And that's changing our understanding. So why focus on boys and men of color? Some of the biggest rationales for focusing on boys and men of color are the fact that they show gross disparities in particular negative outcomes. Violent victimization and offending, crime, and incarceration. This data has been around for a long time and been influencing this work and giving priority to this work. It's important, violent victimization, offending, crime, and incarceration, but it's the tip of the iceberg. What's more important, in my estimation and among other folks, are that males of color are showing negative or stagnant trends in key opportunity outcomes relative to females. Employment and earnings, high school graduation, college enrollment, and completion. And we'll see some of this data. We don't have time to cover it all. But the part that I just articulated at the beginning, which is really the linchpin of this first half of the presentation that I want to convince you of, are that there's a vicious cycle of intergenerational male-specific disadvantage. Disadvantaged families in particular are disproportionately more damaging to male educational outcomes than females. And by disadvantaged families, I mean single-parent families and low-income families. Boys tend to have worse educational outcomes than their sisters when they grow up in these families, and it leads long-term to worse employment outcomes. So declining employment and earnings. Over the past 40 years, our economy has changed a lot. Our economy has not only changed a lot because it's not heavily focused on manufacturing, it has now shifted to services, and it's shifted to what's called a bifurcated service economy. One that's high-wage services like computer programmers, finance, and so forth, and low-wage, people who work at Walmart, McDonald's, and so forth. That's the lion's share of jobs have split in those two directions. And so that has meant that a lot of employment that used to pay well to men, particularly men who only had a high school diploma or didn't go to college, many of those jobs have vanished. And the biggest part of that story is not what we heard in this last election. It's not globalization. It's not sending jobs overseas or letting imports into our country. That's important, but that's not the driver of it. The reality of what's been eliminating jobs in our country is automation, computers and robots. That's what's getting rid of jobs. And the problem is that it's not stopping at manufacturing jobs. It's going all the way up the food chain. Jobs, so I got my master's degree in information systems, basically programming, in the 1990s. Many of the things that I learned to do then are now being automated in other software languages. So medical practices, anything you can think of people having to go to college for 8 or 10 years of graduate school, even those types of jobs are being automated. There is no job that's protected from automation of information services. And so the reality is we can close our borders all day long, but we're killing the jobs inside with technology. That's just the frank reality of it. And so we have to address the implications of that. There are some interesting proposals out there, and I want to give people hope, because when I say that, people get alarmed. There's a proposal that when you actually automate a job with a robot or a computer program, that robot or computer program has to pay taxes. So we tax it like it's a person. And so at least money is going into our public coffers that can offset the loss of jobs to people in the real world. And I think that's actually a very interesting proposal. But people are trying to come up with these ideas of how we respond to the real job killer, which is technology and not globalization. But globalization matters. And globalization continues to move up the skill ladder as well. So we're continuing to export higher and higher skilled jobs. One of the places where many of those jobs are going are China, particularly in the 2000s. But there's also the decline in unions across the country, which still matters a lot, particularly in the Midwest and the Northeast. It matters out in places like California, but to a lesser degree. But the decline in unions matters not only because you lose high-paying jobs with full-time high-paying jobs with security and benefits, but the difference is that when unions were strong, they advocated for worker protections for everybody. So as they've declined in political influence, so have the variety of worker protections. Getting a minimum wage passed is much more difficult now than it was, say, in the 1980s and 1970s. The suburbanization of low-skilled jobs, what's referred to as spatial mismatch. Now, this is still a significant problem. What spatial mismatch refers to is the fact that African Americans, Latinos in particular, are historically concentrated in the central cities, although they've been suburbanizing. And a lot of Latinos are actually bypassing central cities now and moving directly to suburbs. And poverty has been moving to suburbs. But the problem is the majority of job growth in the low-wage labor market, particularly the service sector, has occurred in the far outreaches of suburban areas. Meaning the majority of the job growth is far removed from the central city where African American and Latinos are historically concentrated. That's what's referred to as a spatial mismatch. So this distance gap has reduced employment for those folks who live in the central cities. Partly because of what's called reverse commuting transportation infrastructures. We don't really build transportation infrastructures effectively to commute from the central cities to the suburbs, so that presents its own challenges. But other evidence is showing that social networks probably matter as much as distance. So if you're not around people who are in those types of jobs, you don't hear about openings. You don't hear about these various types of opportunities. You don't have someone to vouch for you when you go in for an interview. And so those types of gaps, it's both social and geographic, that appear to be contributing to spatial mismatch in terms of employment for folks in the central city. Legal discrimination against felons. This didn't used to be that big a deal because we didn't have that many felons. Now we have about 15 million felons. And so this now has a significant effect on their employment prospects, particularly for African American and Latino males. We're going to look at the data, but folks have been trying to tease out what's been going on, why prime working age men have been withdrawing from the labor market. Folks at some conservative leaning think tanks said disability benefits. There's always a rationale to deconstruct the welfare state a little bit more. But their rationale was that disability benefits are too generous, and so men are opting for disability benefits and not going into jobs. Because the labor force participation rate of prime age working men was in the mid-90s, like 95, 96 in the 1950s and 60s. Now it's down to about the mid-80s. So that means 15%. And then when you look further, it's more concentrated among men who don't graduate from high school. The big answer, I think, is the fact that so many of these men have felony convictions. Felony convictions is basically you're locked permanently out of the employment labor market, and we kind of agreed as a society that's okay. You're legally discriminated against because you have a felony conviction. That is a big part of this story, as much as disability benefits, I think, are a small part. But the reality is, we're not just seeing it in the United States. We're seeing this phenomenon across the industrialized world. It's just not as bad as it is in the United States. We do everything kind of better than other places, including having folks withdraw from the formal labor market. And then there's just the continuation of illegal employment discrimination in low-wage jobs, particularly against African Americans. Audit studies continue to find this pattern across major city economies, where, and what an audit study is you send somebody in, they're kind of fictitious actors. You send them in with identical credentials applying for the same job, and you do a sample of, say, 300 or 400 people, and you see how many get callbacks. And they find significant disparities consistently for African Americans relative to white males. And also, Latinos are about comparable to white males in terms of their access to low-wage labor employment. So this shows up these factors show up in trend lines that we've seen over the past 60 years and what are called joblessness. Joblessness is a specific metric from the US Census that tells us people who've had no employment in the prior 12 months. These are people who are long-term jobless. These are people who, when they enter this phase of unemployment, they have rapidly diminishing prospects of ever returning to the formal labor market. So when we see this scale of employment, it's alarming because it means these folks are likely to spend the rest of their lives either not employed at all or marginally and unstably employed. This data is different from the types of indicators you see reported by the federal government that we get quarterly, our quarterly labor force participation or unemployment statistics. The reason that this number is different is because it's based upon the US Census, which surveys everybody in our society. The feds report their data based upon what's called the Current Population Survey, which is a household survey only administered to people who live in houses. So it leaves out the 2.3 million people who are incarcerated. If you add them back in, you start to see significantly worse jobless numbers for different groups. So here's the trend line for the past 60 years. What that last number means is that 2 out of 5 black males between the ages of 18 and 61 had no job in the prior 12 months in 2010. Latinos, this is native-born Latinos. A quarter of native-born Latinos had no job in the prior 12 months. And approaching 1 in 5 white males had no employment in the prior 12 months. And this is concentrated heavily among those who didn't attend college. Now, these numbers are really bad in 2010 because this is the height of the job loss of the Great Recession. So that's why that's that elevated. The problem is that if you look across 1950 to 2010, we've had roughly 7 recessions over that amount of time. And the numbers never go back down. We have what's called a secular trend, meaning this is continuing up in this direction. There may be minor fluctuations from this year to this year, but the reality is we're seeing a structural shift in the economy where males are in significant part withdrawing from it. And these numbers are pretty stark for what we see here. If we look at those who just graduate from college, the numbers are obviously a lot smaller and they're a lot closer together. They're separated by 3 or 4 percentage points, not 15, 17 percentage points or 20 percentage points. So if you cross that college degree threshold, there's a lot of shared prospects in terms of employment. Not the same in terms of earnings, but a lot of similarities. But when we talk about those who don't go to college, there are enormous gaps. There are enormous gaps in the prospects of employment and earnings. Mass incarceration, along with declining employment and earnings, mass incarceration looms large in this story over the past 40 years. This is what our incarceration rate has looked like from a historical perspective for the 20th century. We had a fairly stable rate of incarceration until about 1972, and then we lost our minds with respect to penal policy and produced one of the most unprecedented expansions in incarceration ever in modern history. The only comparable example of a society that decided to start incarcerating its population at this scale is Stalinist Russia's Gulag system. That's the only other place that this has happened at this level. And it's unparalleled. But the reality of this 430% increase in federal and state prisoners between 1973 and 2010 is that we decided to do this. We decided to do this. This increase in incarceration is not because violent crime has been on this secular rise that produced this massive growth. And that's what a lot of folks attribute this to. We decided that for the exact same crimes, you are more likely to go to prison after 1972 than you would have before 1972. So that often meant converting what used to be misdemeanors to felonies. And the second thing is we made sure that you went to prison for a lot longer after 1972 than you would have ever gone to prison before 1972. So that means we converted misdemeanors to felonies, and then we expanded the sentencing guidelines so that you got 2-3 times as much time than you would have gotten before 1972. We also had a fundamental change starting in the 1980s of prosecutorial behavior. Prosecutors in the 1950s and 1960s would typically charge you for the most serious crime you were being accused of, serious charge, and that's the charge they would pursue, and they would get a plea bargain or they'd go to trial. After we started increasing these punishments, after we started expanding the sentences, prosecutors started charging you with every single conceivable crime that they could throw at you, all in the objective of securing a plea deal, because no prosecutor wants to prosecute all those cases. So what happened is you have all these people taking very exaggerated plea bargain deals. They're taking very large scale time because the option is not available for just picking the most serious offense and then attaching it to the sentence proposal for the plea bargain to that. They would lump it all together, and then make you take some significant accumulation of time. Now, a big part of the reason that people argue that this structural problem exists is because prosecutors don't have to pay for their prisoners, essentially. Meaning counties don't have to pay for their prisoners. We've changed that incentive a bit in California with what's called criminal justice realignment. We basically say, we gave a grace period, but basically, if you look across California, there are widely disparate probabilities of sending people to prison for violent crimes. In Alameda County and San Francisco, for example, almost nobody goes to state prison. You have to really commit some serious violent crimes or some serious felonies to go to state prison. But if you just look at the rates of people who go to prison for violent crime rate, Alameda County and San Francisco are about, I think, 0.5 people go to prison per violent crime. But you look at places like Kings County, for example. Kings County sends 2 people to prison for every violent crime. They send everybody. And the reason they do that is because Kings County doesn't want to pay for jails. Kings County wants the rest of us to pay for Kings County's jails, and so they send them to state prison. And so if you treat everybody who comes through your doors as somebody who should go to state prison, you get that off your books. You're not responsible for it. Whereas Alameda County and San Francisco County, they pay for their prisoners in jails. So what Realignment did is they said, we're going to give you a grace period, but from now on, you have to start paying for your prisoners. And the funny thing is when that happens, people stop sending as many people to prison. You've changed, realigned incentives because the county budgets start to feel the heat. And so many people feel like the only way to rein in prosecutors across the country is to force counties to pay for it, to push the cost locally, because as soon as states pick up the dime, everybody is willing to be overly punitive because you can just send those people to the state. Yes?
2 questions for you. First of all, what happened in 1972? Was there a particular policy or suite of policies that marked the beginning of that era? And then secondly, is it too soon to start seeing data yet from the realignment that's happened? Or have you seen shifts?
I have seen shifts. Yeah, the numbers are all falling in terms of realignment, and the data is available on that. In terms of 1972, there's really not. There's not a specific federal policy. State policy is what drove this massive expansion. We've looked to the feds as funding, the 1994 crime bill funded prison expansion across the country, but it wasn't a huge engine. A lot of states were willing to pay for it themselves. We just massively expanded. This just became a movement. It became a movement. I would say the influence started at the federal level, at an ideological level. The states embraced it as policy innovation, and it spread like wildfire. And then the counties started to shift their behavior and take advantage of these new state tools. So everybody's kind of a conspirator in this game, but it was very fluid. And that's the reason why people are concerned about how we take this thing apart. It's much harder to take apart when it's a kind of diffuse system versus the feds change policy. Federal government can change policy, but they're not going to actually put a dent in this. Most of it is going to be at the state level, and to get the locals to change, we have to push costs down. That's just generally what folks are arguing now from a policy standpoint. So the implications of this are stark because it's not just the people that we put in cells that's the problem. Felony conviction and/or imprisonment reduces lifetime earnings and employment by 10 to 30% when you're released. So when you get out of prison, you can basically shave 1/3 off your potential earnings. And let's be clear, that's 1/3 off of earnings not for someone who'd worked as an accountant or a lawyer. It's someone who'd otherwise work at Walmart. We're talking about shaving 30% off an already existing poverty wage. And so we're talking about destitution. We're talking about guaranteeing a very large number, and I told you 15 million folks have felony convictions. So this is a large footprint of the population. The consequences of that are not that you just lock these adults in that long-term destitution, you lock their children there. This is an intergenerational phenomenon. Many folks feel like, it's going to take us 2 to 3 generations for the consequences of mass incarceration to wash out of the populace, to wash out of its effects. And that's only if we started today. So in many ways, it's like climate change. It's like global warming. If we started today, we might be lucky 100 years from now. In many ways, mass incarceration has that similar insidious effect. Now, the important thing about this felony, this long-term effect on earnings, is that it's not driven by whether or not you actually spent time in a cell. It's driven by the felony conviction. The felony conviction, the scarlet letter, is what drives this long-term effect. So the reality is we can let half of our prison population out tomorrow. We have half as many prisoners, but we still have the same number of felons. And so we still have this long-term employment effect, which is the collateral consequence of incarceration. So what many states are entertaining is, what do you do about changing this, stigma? It is called in economic theory an economic signal to the labor market that this person is a problematic employee. There's been a couple different proposals. One proposal is to, there's three different proposals. One proposal is to bar employers from being able to see a felony conviction until it matters less in their hiring decision. And that's something that's referred to as ban the box in various incarnations. We're basically saying, we take the box off the employment application so they can't be weeded out, and then if you actually want to hire a person, then you ask them if they have a felony conviction, and then you're less likely to weed them out because you've already made decisions on other criteria you might want to hire them. Another option is to try to change the meaning of the felony conviction. And so what has happened in places like New York, they've piloted a program called Enhanced Certificates of Rehabilitation. Certificates of rehabilitation have been on the books since the 1970s, and basically it's a way of saying to employers, this person has served their time, we're vouching for them being eligible to re-participate in society. So feel free to hire them. The problem is that in the same statutes, there's also code that says if you hire a felon, knowing they're a felon, and they commit a crime while in your employment, you can be held liable. So employers are like, well, I'm not doing that. It's a perfectly rational decision. And so what New York decided to do is it said, okay, in our certificates of rehabilitation program, if you hire a felon who has a certificate of rehabilitation from us, and they have to jump through some hoops to get the rehabilitation certificate. You have to do this, you have to not commit reoffenses, you have to show positive progress towards something. And if you do that, the state of New York will indemnify you against liability if they commit a crime while in your employment. And so they're basically trying to reverse that. But the reality is, only the most forward-thinking employers are going to still take that risk, because they don't have to. They have an extremely slack labor market. They don't have to hire felons. We don't have enough jobs to go around. And so that's the reality that's pressing upon this. And so you have an alternative, which is what happened in California with Prop 47, where we basically said people can get rid of the felony altogether. If you don't have a whole string of very violent felonies, but you have this specific set of felonies, and you meet these requirements, you can go file a form with the judge and have all your felonies downgraded to misdemeanors. And those misdemeanors in turn can be expunged. So you can eliminate your criminal record. We still have the reality that some of those records look around in proprietary databases online, which employers still use, but you have grounds to get those removed and talk to those proprietary databases about getting those removed. So that's the spectrum, and California's gone the furthest of anybody in saying we're going to actually eliminate the felony conviction. In my opinion, that's the only way to go, because ban the box has very perverse consequences. What we found is that in the private sector, when you take away the box, it makes employers less likely to hire African-American males at all. Because absent the signal of who's got a felony conviction and who doesn't, a black male essentially can't prove he's not a criminal, so they get all weeded out, essentially. So the irony is that in places where background checks are mandatory, African Americans are significantly more likely to get hired than they are in the general labor market. So when it's mandatory, they're more likely to get jobs. In industries that require drug testing as mandatory, African American males are more likely to get employed than in industries that do not. So essentially, if an African American male can't prove that he's not a drug addict or not a felon, he's less likely to get hired through what's called statistical discrimination. We just weed them all out collectively. And so there's a perverse backfire effect of the ban the box approach, which I'm constantly telling folks about, thinking that it's a panacea for this scarlet letter problem of a felony conviction. So what do we get for this scale of incarceration? We get what that really tall orange bar is saying right there. 70% of black males who drop out of high school will go to prison in their lifetime, nationally, in the United States. But look at that number. Only 21% of black males who get their high school diploma or GED will go to prison in their lifetime. So for a black male in this country, getting a high school diploma is literally a ticket out of prison. It is escape hatch from prison. The evidence is very clear from a variety of studies that this relationship is not merely a selection effect, meaning kids who are more likely to drop out of high school are more likely to go to prison, and kids who are more likely to graduate from high school are less likely to go to prison. It turns out graduating from high school has a very strong causal effect on your likelihood of going to prison. And there's a variety of ways we can demonstrate this, but one of the most compelling ways are what's called a natural experiment, looking at the 1970s and 1980s, when states at different times increased their age of compulsory education. It used to be that you only had to attend school till age 16. But that changed a lot in the 1970s and 1980s, where different states at different times increased their school age from 16 to 18. And so a study looked at, because states did it at different times, it's basically the equivalent of an experiment where you can see before and after what happened to their crime rates. And they found consistently for each state across the country that when you increased your high school graduation from 16 to 18, their crime rates fell dramatically. So when you force people to stay in school and graduate, they're much less likely to become criminals and go to prison. The story is actually worse for California because 90% of black males who drop out of high school in this state go to prison in their lifetime. And this drops to 12%. A 78 percentage point difference between, for black males who graduate from high school versus those who drop out in terms of their risk of going to prison. So education is much more than a pathway into employment and opportunity, although that's probably the causal reason why it's such a prevention of going into prison, why it's such a preventative pathway of going into prison. For other groups, we see something here about showing that the blue is actually for Latinos. And this is, shows that Latinos have actually a lower rate than white male high school dropouts of going to prison in their lifetime. Now, part of the reason I think that number is lower, and there's significant amount of evidence for it, is that there's two different populations that are confounded in that 20% rate for Latinos. What I mean is, it's including both foreign-born and native-born Latinos. The reality is actually that 80 to 90% of Latinos who go to prison were born in this country. Only a small fraction of those from other countries actually go to prison. But if you look at the Latino population between the ages of 18 and 61 who are males, more than half are foreign-born Latinos. And so you got a population that's inside prison that is very foreign-born, and a population outside of prison that's mostly, the population inside is very native-born, and a population outside that's mostly foreign-born. And so if you take one over the other as denominator, you start to get these low numbers. But if we just compare native-born Latinos inside prison to native-born Latinos outside of prison, this number starts to rise substantially and look a lot more like African Americans. And the population that it looks a lot more like are Native Americans. And so the through line in this story is that if you grow up in this country or are exposed to many of the disadvantage at a neighborhood or educational level that African American, Latino, and Native American males experience, you have high rates of going to prison. The nativity is the unifying experience that explains these scales of imprisonment across these population groups. But when we look at the foreign-born, we see a far rosier story. So how does our rate of incarceration compare to crime rates over the past 25 years? Homicide has declined by 54%, rape by 40%, robbery by 60%, assault by 47%, and our incarceration has gone up by 53%. Now, some folks used to argue, they don't anymore, that the reason that all these things happen is because of that, because we locked up the bad guys. But the reality is that these two things have been uncorrelated since 1990. They're not even correlated. It's not a causal thing. They're not even related to each other. What we find is that you have the majority, the common story is that a state has been reducing its incarcerated population substantially, and its crime rate has been falling faster. That is the normal story. That we let people out of prison, and yet our crime rate has continued to fall dramatically. That is the predominant story across states who have the most prisoners in this country. So since 1990, we haven't gotten much bang for the buck in terms of incarceration for reducing violent crime. Violent crime has been reducing for other reasons. Yes?
Are you going to explain that a little bit more?
Sure.
Okay.
What would you?
Well, I'm just, so it's not correlated, so then what is the reason for the decline in?
We actually don't know. You know, if there's a lot of theories out there. Some have been popularized and have been debunked. One of them was the Freakonomics abortion theory. That's been thoroughly debunked. If folks have heard that or watched that book or watched that movie, Stephen Levitt proffered the idea that when we basically legalized abortion in the 1970s, then people killed all the babies that would otherwise have become criminals. That was basically his thesis. And he said that's why we saw this kind of violence. A lot of people were actually buying into that idea, but it's been thoroughly debunked. Some of the arguments, so one simple answer is that policing is far better at reducing violent crime than incarceration is. meaning good policing prevents crime from happening, rather than locking people up after they committed crime. So that's one thing. Two, we've seen, what other factors have been in play? High school graduation has been improving consistently since 2000. So that's an important factor in the declining of violent crime. So people are actually staying in school and graduating, and that's reducing it. What other factors? The reality is that we have not got the number of possible factors below 12, and nobody can rule out, and none of them explain more than a small amount of the variation statistically. So it could be, and the thing is, we've also seen violent crime decline in Europe and other countries as well. It's across the globe of industrialized countries. And so we don't fully know what's driving it. There's a lot of factors at play. It's just another one of those trends where it's a whole bunch of stuff that seems to be at play. In California, these are incarceration rates in terms of the share of the prison population is the bars, and the rates are above them. This is pre-alignment, though, so I haven't updated this with post-realignment data because folks now are going locally rather than the state prison population. But you can see the rates of incarceration, the variations, African Americans at 1,648, Latinos at 520, and then whites at about half the Latino rate. So, I'm taking way too long. So another major factor, along with, we talked about the decline in employment and earnings and the rise in mass incarceration. A third major factor is the change in parents, families over the past 40 years, the rise in single-parent families. Now, there's a fantastic book by this guy named Andrew Cherlin called Labor's Love Lost, The Decline of the Working Class Family in America. And what he's basically looking at is what has been the drivers. First of all, what's the story behind the rise in single-parent families over the 20th century? And what's the explanation behind it? What might explain the rise in single-parent families? He's responding to a series of books by this guy named Charles Murray, who, how many people have heard of Charles Murray? How many people have heard of a book called The Bell Curve? Okay, so he's a co-author of that book. And that was one of his first forays into what I call pseudo-scientific analysis of statistical causal patterns. But he came out after The Bell Curve with a book called Losing Ground in the 1990s, which was very informative in the welfare reform debate. And he basically made the argument that the rise in single-parent families, specifically among African Americans, was the result of people having bad values and a federal government that was providing too generous of welfare benefits to families. So when you combine bad values and too much support, you get single-parent families. You get people having babies for the financial benefit. That was the rationale that he was making. And so this was influential in basically deconstructing the welfare state, shifting from what's called aid to families with dependent children to what's now called temporary assistance to needy families, TANF. And so we basically limited the benefit to 5 years. We required that folks go to work, many things that you all probably in this room already know. So then a decade later, Charles Murray strikes again and writes a book called Coming Apart, in which he says, the same thing I was describing that black folks are doing in the 1990s, white folks are now doing now. He said, white folks now have the bad values. We no longer have the bad welfare state because he helped ideologically deconstruct that. He just says bad values are the problem. So Andrew Cherlin is like, hold on now. Hold on, let's actually look at the data on this. And so what he did is he analyzed census data from 1880 to 2010, 130 years of census data, and he wanted to understand the change in the American family over the course of shifting from an agrarian to an industrial to a post-industrial society. And what he found is that the traditional family model that Charles Murray says we should go back to is a specific type of family model. It is a family model where the mother stays home, takes care of the kids, and the father goes out and works in the labor market, earns the bread, if you will, and brings it home for the family. So the domestic sphere and the work sphere are separated from each other, and they're gendered. The women have the domestic sphere, the man has the work sphere. He wanted to find out, Andrew Cherlin, when did this family model emerge? When did we first start seeing this family type? And it turns out we started to see it just appear in the census record in the 1880s, 1890s, but it remained a tiny fraction of families. The vast majority of family types at that time were the agrarian family model, where mother and father stayed on the farm with all the kids, and that's where they worked. They did all the work, all the domestic sphere, all of that was combined. It was different for African Americans because African American women have been working outside the home since the end of slavery. So they've always had an outside the home relationship with work. But for the vast majority of people, it was inside the house, inside the home. And so what caused that to change was the Industrial Revolution in the United States, our shift to an industrial economy where people started moving to cities and then men started going out working the labor market and women started staying home. But he basically said that that family model didn't really kick into gear until the 1940s. So from 1880, 1890, all the way up to the 1940s, it was a very small fraction of families. And then it just exploded. It exploded through the 1940s and into the 1950s. And in the course of 2 decades, it became the predominant family model in America. In the middle of the 1950s, it became the predominant family model for basically white families. In the middle of the 1950s, mid to late 1950s, it comprised 55% of white American families. It didn't comprise that size for African Americans because they hadn't fully made the shift yet. There was still a lot of placement in agrarian environments. And then it remained strong for about the next 2 decades, and then it started to rapidly decrease. It started to decrease much earlier for African Americans, partly because of the explanation for why it grew and exploded in the 1950s. And Andrew Cherlin's answer is very simple. It was the economy. We had the most generous expansion in the U.S. economy that we've ever seen. From 1945 to 1975, the U.S. economy not only grew enormously, but it was equitably shared. So that means if you were a CEO or you swept floors, for that 30 years, your real income doubled from 1945 to 1975. Housing went from being expensive to being almost costing nothing. We built massive housing. We poured tons of money into it. We built suburban highways so that people can move out on cheap land with brand new tract housing and have the American dream. We started to have things like washing machines and all these appliances. All these amenities made life cheap, much less expensive. Plus, our schools provided so many different things that they don't provide anymore. They provided all kinds of after-school activities. All kinds of enrichment things were built into our public systems. And so basically he said we had massive growth and opportunity during that amount of time. And so it was possible for somebody who just had a high school diploma to walk out of high school and get a job paying a middle-class wage that was sufficient to support a family for decades. And then he said that economy started to fall apart in the 1970s. And it's so clear the change in American families that started to shift during that. The growth in unmarried and divorced white families started to explode in the 1970s and 1980s. And has been growing ever since. It continues to grow. It happened much earlier for African Americans, and the simple story is they weren't fully incorporated into that magical economy. It wasn't until the late 1960s that the civil rights laws opened up the ability for African Americans to move into those excellent paying jobs. And in the 1970s, just a few years later, those jobs started rapidly disappearing from the economy. And so African Americans, in many ways, didn't get their foot in the door before the game started to change, essentially. And so his basic argument is that if you look at different groups over the 20th century, what has been the most important factor in driving family formation and family dissolution is whether a male had a good paying job. And to this day, the number one predictor of divorce is whether a male is employed. This becomes more and more pronounced over time, and the fact that so many males are withdrawing from the labor market should tell you that the story of the rise of single-parent families is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. There's been also a decline in marriageable males, particularly not just because of their employment prospects, but because of mortality and incarceration. I won't go into that specific statistic, but the reality is that in a prime working age between the ages of 25 and 54, there literally aren't enough men to women ratio to have two-parent families. There are not enough guys around. There are too many that are dead or incarcerated. In the case of the country, for every 100 women, there are 17 black men between the ages of 25 and 54 who are dead or incarcerated. So there's literally not enough people to form two-parent families. And then incarceration reduces male parental involvement. So these are the rates of single-parent families in 2013. 11% of Asian children, 20% of white children, a third of Latino children, 40% of Native American children, and almost 60% of black children. And these numbers are all higher in California, and they're all continuing to grow over time. They're not abating or returning. So 10, 15 years from now, the predominant family model across this group is going to be single-parent families. But our welfare state punishes single-parent families. Our institutions punish single-parent families. It's considered perverse. And so there are so many ways and so many different avenues that where we make single-parent families, their lives difficult. You look at earned income tax credit. Very important, the most powerful poverty-reducing policy that we have on the books. It doesn't work for parents who don't live together. It will work for the mother who lives with the child, but the father who doesn't live with the child is ineligible. Our child support regime, established after under TANF, requires that a father, sometimes they're 17 or 18 or 19 years old when they have their child, If their mother, after a paternity is established, if that mother goes on public assistance, meaning gets welfare, TANF, the father has to start making child support payments, not to the mother, but to the government. He has to start paying the government back for public assistance, regardless of his ability to pay, and the debt is not dischargeable. So essentially, you have a 19-year-old male, black male, who may have dropped out of high school, who has a kid. By the time that kid's 7 or 8 years old, he may start thinking about entering the labor market, but he owes $10,000 in back child support to the government, not to the mother of his child, who he might give money regularly, he might see his child regularly. So the reality is not that it prevents money from going from a father who otherwise could be employed to the kid, it prevents the father from ever entering the labor market. He makes a calculated decision. It turns out under federal law, local governments can take up to 60% of your pre-tax wages to satisfy a child support arrear. And you're not eligible for the earned income tax credit. You're not eligible for a variety of tax credits to parents with children because you don't live with your kid. We require that you have that you cohabit with your child to be eligible. So we essentially are punishing single-parent families by virtue of this gendered division in terms of child support and the beneficiary of tax credits for having children. And that's just the start of it. The list goes on and on about how we've made these types of families much worse off as a practical policy decision, when the reality is we could help these families who are worse off because of their economic prospects. So what are the consequences of growing up in a single-parent family? This story is all to get to this critical issue of when a child grows up in a single-parent family, a boy compared to a girl do differently on long-term educational outcomes as a consequence. Now, we don't fully know the reason why. I can't answer the explanation of why boys who grow up in single-parent families or low-income families do worse than their sisters, but the evidence is very clear that the relationship is a causal effect and not just a correlation. Boys who growing up in a single-parent family reduces college attendance for boys, but not for girls. It increases juvenile delinquency among boys, but not among girls. It increases behavior problems significantly more among boys than it does among girls. And both juvenile delinquency and behavioral problems are strongly predictive of educational outcomes, whether you graduate from high school. A study based upon a sample of 1 million kids followed longitudinally from before kindergarten all the way up to their mid to late 20s shows that kids from single-parent families, that boys and girls start diverging in academic outcomes as early as kindergarten, and the gap grows over time all the way up into employment indicators by the time they're in their early to mid-20s. And because they were able to follow 1 million kids, they were able to establish a causal relationship through what's called matching. So they're able to match up kids on every other variable except one lives in a single-parent family and one doesn't, and compare boys and girls who follow those trajectories. And what they find is that it's the causal effect of growing up in that family, in a single-parent family. Another study done with 10 million kids using IRS data following them longitudinally from childhood into adulthood shows that boys and girls, so generally when boys and girls hit age 30 in the general population, males are substantially more likely to be employed by age 30 than females. There's a labor market participation rate in favor of boys, males, by the time they hit age 30. But that relationship is reversed for kids who grew up in single-parent families. By the time they hit age 30, females are substantially more likely to be employed than males are. And so that's a big factor that explains why labor force participation rates, employment rates for black males and black females are essentially equal in our country. That's not true for any other group. For every other group, the males are substantially more likely to be employed than the females. And so one of the things when we look at different types of family models, some people have asked, well, what's worse, an unmarried family, a divorced family, or well, basically those are the two primary categories. And it turns out the worst family type for a boy's educational outcomes is a family that is either unmarried or divorced where a new male is in the household. So a blended family turns out to be the worst for educational outcomes for boys. Why that is exactly is not entirely clear. There's a lot of theories that people have. People who live in these families probably have their own theories about, competition or attachment to the father. Who knows what's at play? But a blended family, which in theory puts a male in the household, turns out to be worse than no male in the household at all. So family complexity is very detrimental to the outcomes for males. So we see this show up in stagnant educational attainment trends or opening gaps, gender gaps over the past 40 years. This is high school graduation rates from 1970 to 2010 for black, white, and Latino boys and girls. This is a high school graduation trend line for white girls from 1970 to 2010. We see that almost 90% of white girls nationally graduate from high school in 2010. And this is the rate for white boys, who graduated from high school at a higher rate than white girls in the 1970s, early 1970s. And they've switched places, and now a gap has opened up and continues to grow over time. This is the high school graduation rate for black girls. From that deficit in 1970 to now graduating at a rate equal to white boys in 2010. This is the rate for black boys. So black girls have graduated from high school at a higher rate than black boys since before the Great Depression. That's been a long-standing gender gap, but that gap was always small like that. It's in the past 40 years that it's opened up to this sizable gap. And this is Latino girls, now graduating from high school at a rate almost equal to white boys and black girls from that deficit in 1970. And this is Latino boys, who also graduated at a higher rate in 1970 than Latino girls. They switched places, and a sizable gap has opened up and grown over time. And these gaps have grown or remained sizable in spite of the fact that Latino and black males have had the highest growth in high school graduation rates in the past decade. The gap is still not closed. Girls are still moving relatively as fast. The gap still remains substantial. So I wanted to show you California's high school graduation rates, a snapshot in 2013, 2014, using CalPADS data so you could see where folks stack up. So African American males, 62% have the lowest high school graduation rates. And if we go back to 90% of those who don't graduate go to prison, you can see how big that number is. Native American males, 67%, Latino males, black females. Now, black females graduate from high school at 12 percentage points higher than black males. That's the largest racial gender gap. But black females are also the lowest graduating girl in the state. So back to my point earlier about they're doing better than boys, but they're doing terribly relative to other girls. Native American females, 75%. Pacific Islander males is 76%. Latino females, 80%, 81%. Pacific Islander females, 85%. White males, 85%. Filipino males, 90%. White females, 90%. Asian males, 91%. Asian females, 94%. Filipino females, 94% at the highest level. Now, every girl in every racial group is doing better than boys. But we're also seeing this pattern replicated in Germany, in France, in Britain, in South Korea, in Japan. It's happening in Asia and Europe. It's happening all across the United States. We don't know why that big global trend is happening. We don't understand why girls are outpacing boys. But the reality is that in America, the gaps are far larger than they are anywhere else. You have 2, 3, 5 percentage points difference in other places. In the US is where we get the 8, 10, 12 percentage point differences. So that's the first half of the, actually no, that's not the first half. Let me put all these pieces together that we just looked at. We looked at declining employment and earnings, largely driven by automation, but also globalization. We talked about mass incarceration and a big supplement in the 1980s and 90s of the war, 1980s and 90s of the war on drugs. Both of those independently contribute to the growth in disadvantaged families. And disadvantaged families, we just looked at single-parent families, but the phenomena is replicated among low-income families. So boys do worse than girls in low-income families as well. We see a gender-specific effect of educational attainment, meaning boys in these families do worse on educational outcomes than their sisters. And you have essentially the makings of an intergenerational cycle. Boys' stagnant educational outcomes lowers their employment prospects, raises the probability they'll go to prison in a lifetime, start a family that will eventually dissolve and repeat the cycle again for their sons. So it's a gender-specific cycle through father to son over the past 40 years. But the important thing about this cycle, though, is that it's concentrated. It's concentrated in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty or concentrated disadvantage, which also started to appear for the first time in the 1970s. We didn't see neighborhoods where 50, 60, or 70% of the male population had no employment. We didn't see that before the 1970s. We started to see it rise to 40%, 50%. Now you have neighborhoods where the rates are 75, 80% of the men in that neighborhood have no job, have had no job for the prior year. So this phenomenon is concentrated, and so you get this cycle concentrated in specific places. Fresno County has the highest, I think, among, or if not the highest concentrated poverty rate in the country. This cycle is unfolding in those neighborhoods. It's concentrated in those neighborhoods. When you concentrate poverty, and concentrate joblessness, you concentrate everything that associates with those things. Crime, violence, poor school quality, drugs, disinvestment. So you create neighborhoods that are extraordinarily inhospitable to the development of children. And Rod Chetty recently provided data that shows that this effect is not only causal, but it's substantial. It's very large. He reanalyzed data of the Moving to Opportunity experiment. How many people have heard of Moving to Opportunity? So Moving to Opportunity was a national experiment conducted by HUD, where they took 5,500 families that lived in public housing in 5 cities, Baltimore, Los Angeles, Chicago, and 2 others. And they basically gave families vouchers to move out of these highly poverty neighborhoods into lower poverty neighborhoods. The requirement was that they had to move into a neighborhood that had a poverty rate that I believe was 10% or lower. And so you essentially have people who are accustomed to living in neighborhoods that are 50 and 60% poverty and move them to these low poverty neighborhoods. And they wanted to see that when you randomly assign these groups, an experimental group to move out, and you compare them to those who stayed, did the people who moved do better on employment outcomes, and did the kids do better? And what they found generally at the 15-year follow-up is not really. They didn't do that much better. People were alarmed because they knew neighborhoods matter, but they didn't know why these better off neighborhoods didn't change things. What they found is that mothers' mental health improved substantially, and that girls' behavioral outcomes improved substantially, but boys actually showed worse behavioral outcomes when they moved to these better off neighborhoods. And there's a long list of studies that have looked at and tried to tease out why this was the case, but it was demoralizing to everybody because it made it seem like, okay, well, if going to a better neighborhood doesn't make people better off, then what do we do? So Rod Chetty came along and he did something remarkable. He analyzed IRS data on the youngest kids that moved, and he looked at their income and earnings by the time they turned 26. And what he found is that if you moved out of that bad neighborhood before you turned age 13, you had, for each year you spent in that better neighborhood, a linear dose-response relationship in terms of improved employment and earnings by the time you were 26 years old. So if you lived there for 5 years before the age of 13, you got 5 years of added benefit. But if you moved after 13, you got no benefit. If you were already an adolescent in a disadvantaged neighborhood before you moved to this new neighborhood, you didn't benefit from the new neighborhood. But you did if you were a child, if you were younger than an adolescent. So what becomes very clear is that the effects of neighborhoods really kick in, particularly during adolescence, and negative bad neighborhoods really kick in during adolescence. The positive effects of good neighborhoods really kick in during childhood. And so that's changed our thinking to recognize that place matters, but that the dosage of place actually matters a lot more negatively by the time you're an adolescent. Because we're concentrating particularly a lot of males who are jobless and involved in the criminal justice system. And so when we concentrate this disadvantage, these are the places overwhelmingly that we're going to pull our incarcerated population from. So your concentrated disadvantaged neighborhoods in Fresno are the overwhelmingly concentrated places where your prisoners are coming from and returning from. 40% of the state prison population is released every year, gets out and is replaced every year. So we have millions of people in prison, but they're a different bunch of millions of people every year. We lose 40%. Almost 1 million people are different every year in prison. So we're constantly churning people in and out of prison back to these neighborhoods in this continuous cycle. We've known since the 1920s the #1 predictor of juvenile delinquency and behavioral problems among boys is whether people keep moving in and out of the neighborhood all the time. And part of the reason why that is because when people move in and out of the neighborhood, neighbors don't know who their neighbors are. And by extension, they don't know who their neighbors' kids are. And so people don't regulate teens that aren't their children in public spaces anymore. If you go back to the 1950s, 1940s, 1960s, people could do that because they knew whose kids were walking around the street and not acting right. And so you could call up their parents. If the neighborhood is constantly turning over, you can't do that anymore. So you lose what's called informal social control. You lose the ability of a community to regulate the behavior of what were essentially are adolescent teenage males. That is really what it is. And so when those unsupervised adolescent teenage male groups predominate, they get plugged into things like crack cocaine industries that then finance their access to guns, you get extremely dangerous neighborhoods. And that's essentially what unfolded over the past 40 years. So that's the bad news. That's the story that's been unfolding. That's the structural reality that we have to contend with in trying to improve educational outcomes. As you can see there, it's not all that's happening in schools. A lot of it's happening in neighborhoods. A lot of it is happening in families. But these are often walled off from each other, both conceptually and in terms of our work practice. We don't blend these relationships in terms of these ecological contexts and how they're shaping educational outcomes. What this life course framework tries to do is to, what I call wrangle the complexity of all these things. It tries to put these structural factors in the same plane as dimensions of human development that I'll explain in a second, so that we can see how our work operates programmatically but within a structural context and confronts big structural factors. And I try to do this in a visual way, and this is essentially a synthesis of a whole bunch of research literature informed by a few different paradigms of human development, among others. But there are three core building blocks of the life course framework. The first is what I call dimensions of human development. And these are the things that we start with in our life, like our genetics, and things that develop over our lives, like our physical health, our cognitive development, our mental health, our socio-emotional skills, as examples of these. And we're going to look at more of these in just a second. These dimensions of human development give rise to what are called life course outcomes. These are the institutional milestones, institutional and competency-related milestones that are tied to specific age spans in our life. So things like school readiness, high school graduation, incarceration, stable full-time employment, homelessness. Now, the reason these outcomes are important is because they have an institutional significance. They trigger some institutional response or are connected to institutional behavior. So, for example, not being competent with what you were supposed to learn in the second grade doesn't just mean you're behind when you go into the third grade. Often it means you don't get to go to the third grade. You get held back. An institutional response happens. So it's not just about the competency or the development. We start to produce divergent pathways. And pathways that we'll look at in a second lead you to a cascade of negative off-track outcomes. So many of these outcomes that we establish in life have an institutional relationship in terms of our family. So the same exact crime that you commit when you're 13 will result in a different outcome than if you committed it when you're 22, right? Totally different institutional response that we've established in society. So many behaviors and outcomes that we've identified trigger a whole different set of institutional cascades. Now, we have a lot of data that tells us what these are, typically. We can track these at a county level, at a city level. We typically know what's going on in the general population with these numbers at any particular time. We almost have no idea what's going on with these things. We very rarely track dimensions of human development, things like physical health, cognitive development in real time that we can identify in a population. We don't know what's going on with our kids. You see a kid misbehaving in class, which could give rise to a disciplinary infraction, but you don't know that the kid was traumatized when he was 3, and that's why he has behavioral problems. He doesn't wear a hat that says that. So we respond with these institutional mechanisms only, not with ones that account for the fact that dimensions of human development are a critical driver of life course outcomes. Places like Santa Clara County are doing what's called a universal assessment, universal testing, where they test kids for all these things starting in kindergarten all the way up through high school, so that they can diversify their service response to kids based upon their background and predispositions, not just based upon these behavioral things that show up. And so we can be more responsive to what drives outcomes, not just the outcome itself. And then the third major component is in ecological and contextual factors, like environmental and experiential factors that interact with each other to shape both how we develop and the outcomes that happen in our life, across our life course. Yes, ma'am.
Can I ask you to step back for a second and tell us a little bit more about Santa Clara's assessment, whereby, did you say that as they're entering kindergarten, there's an assessment that takes place to determine trauma?
It's a battery of assessments of social, emotional, cognitive skills, other skills, and they do it periodically, I think every couple of years, all the way up through, I think, 12 or 13.
They do it every other year?
Yeah.
And it's driven by the school district, do you know?
It's, I don't know if it's by the school district. I think it's at a county level.
Okay.
I think the county is driving it. Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. So let's look more at dimensions of human development. Dimensions of human development includes these following things, and I'm going to just highlight these and then spend a little time emphasizing a couple things. The thing to note about everything I present up here is that everything is based upon a synthesis of research by myself and my colleague that shows that everything that's separated by a comma predicts life course outcomes. Predicts whether we graduate from high school, predicts whether or not we have behavioral problems in middle school. These factors are all predictive of life course outcomes. Physical health, cognitive development, mental health and sense of well-being, socio-emotional development, identity development, content and cultural knowledge, meaning-making spiritual development, moral development, and personality. So there's studies the multiple studies usually associated with each of these factors as predictive of life course outcomes. Now, in physical health, there's been an explosion in research around what's called the biological embedding of adversity. How many people have heard of this idea about the biological embedding of chronic adversity? It essentially refers to the fact that, we've often focused on health outcomes early in life as being driven by genetic-based maladies or toxic substance exposure, kids being exposed to things that lead to health problems. But evidence is actually exploding that it goes deeper than that the exposure to chronic adversity fundamentally alters biological systems at two different levels. One, it alters biological systems at a hormonal level, meaning it changes our hormonal systems, leads to an overproduction of hormones that are actually damaging the cognitive development. But it also affects us at what's called an epigenetic level. How many people are familiar with epigenetics, the concept of epigenetics? Right on, this is a solid group on that. So what our epigenome is, and I want to make the distinction because the research on this is very important and it's exploding. Back in the 1990s, we talked a lot about what's called mapping the human genome. And that if we map the human genome, we'd figure out all the problems that cause us illness and we'd fix them. So it would be an explosion in scientific fixing. That didn't happen. Because what they discovered after they mapped the human genome was that people could have the exact same genome, but different things happen. Different illnesses happen. You take twins, and different results would come out of twins. And how is that possible? They have the same genome. And what they discovered is what those twins had that was different between them is their epigenome. The epigenome is a layer on top of our genetic code. Our genetic code stays the same throughout our entire life, but our epigenome does not. An epigenome is like markers on top of our genetic code that cause certain genes to express or not express. What that means is it actually causes genes that would otherwise be on to turn off, and causes other genes that would otherwise be off to turn on. So the consequence of that is that throughout the course of your life, exposures of different kinds, social exposures, but also toxic exposures, can change your genome and cause different things to happen, and this can extend through well into your life. And so when you have these chronic stressors, these early adversities, when say you're 3 or 4, it fundamentally can alter your genome and your hormonal system so that you're more likely to get heart disease when you're 40. And this is irrespective of the fact that you could be a multi-billionaire when you're 40. You could live the sweetest life on the planet. The problem is you've already had this biologically embedded based on adversities that happened to you when you're 2. I analogize it to like the rings of a tree. Sometimes that biologists can look at the rings of a tree and say, in this particular year, this tree went through an extreme drought, or this tree went through an incredible storm that destroyed it. That's essentially what's happening, and it stays with us, and it alters our biological systems. The part that's scariest about it is that research is showing that it might be heritable, meaning we can pass it on to our kids. So if you experience extreme adversity in a year in your life that alters your epigenome, you can pass those epigenomic markers to your child, which in turn will affect their biology and the expression of their genes. And so that's alarming. But what this is all getting to is that our social exposures in life can have a profound biological imprint that can change how we develop, that can change our cognitive function, that alter our pathways through life. So it's not just that growing up in a poor family means you're deprived of developmental ingredients. You can be actively harmed in an enduring way that even if you were to make it out of that environment, you're going to experience health maladies, mental health maladies, or a variety of other setbacks, even though you ostensibly have made it to a class level, an income level, a privilege level, if you will, that provides you amenities to keep you healthy and to keep you in good spirits. And so these early adversities become embedded, and so preventing these adversities, obviously, is critical, and that's why early childhood is looming so large and how people are thinking about how we change poverty starting at age 0.
Is there an age which the susceptibility to that starts to dial down a bit?
It declines over time consistent with the level of plasticity of the person. So your brain is massively developing in those first few years, up to age 5. So things that happen in those first few years, the reason they stick is because the very thing that they're affecting is being built at the same time. And that's why they have such an enduring effect. When you get up into the ages of adolescence, most of that is solidified. So it's less effective. But when you look at like the Dutch famine is like this critical example where teenagers as much as young adults and children all went through this Dutch famine, and it altered all of their epigenomes, I'm sorry. And so it's still possible, but the mechanisms and the level of exposure that's necessary is probably different when you're 19 versus when you're 2. We've also seen a change in how we prioritize cognitive development with respect to educational outcomes. There's been a growth and an emphasis on what are called non-cognitives, which is, I hate that term because it includes everything but cognitive, which is everything on the planet. But one of those important areas is what's called socio-emotional development. Emotional behavior regulation, autonomy, determination, self-monitoring, metacognition, the ability to monitor your thoughts and correct thought problems, what is usually the target of things like cognitive behavioral therapy. We're seeing that socio-emotional development or these non-cognitive skills are better predictors of long-term outcomes than cognitive skills are. So it used to be the case back in the day that cognitive skills were more important as we were transitioning from an economy based upon brawn to brains. But now we're shifting increasingly to an economy that still relies on brains, but a lot of brains can be automated today. The reality is that some of the best computer programs in the world 10 years ago, 20 years ago, are automated today. And so it's not just cognitive skills anymore. It turns out what can't be automated is your ability to manage a team, to manage people, to interact in environments of collaboration without blowing your top. Socio-emotional skills, the things that are very sensitive to adversity, to early adversities in life. And so we are only beginning to understand and talk about, and there's a lot of stuff I could talk about in terms of interventions and so forth that I can't really get in today because that wasn't the purpose of this presentation. But how we shift schools away from overly punitive approaches that push kids out or punish kids when they should be responding to the underlying factors that are driving behavioral problems, but how in the very classroom we start to teach kids socio-emotional skills. And by that, I'm not talking about something called grit, by the way, which is very overblown right now, the notion of grit. Grit has a lot of similarity to a personality trait called conscientiousness, and people can't actually distinguish the two. And so I'm not entirely sure grit is an independent phenomenon, to be quite frank with you. But you can teach kids socio-emotional skills, and those socio-emotional skills matter. And one of the most important socio-emotional skills, in my estimation, is metacognition, to have kids actually think about their thinking patterns. A program in Chicago that has now expanded significantly, they're moving to Boston, called Becoming a Man. I went out there and did a 2-day site visit with them. And it's a rites of passage program that is infused with cognitive behavioral therapy. And so it creates an identity for young males, a community, a sense of belonging for these young African-American and Latino males. But one of the things it does is it makes them consciously think about their thought patterns all the time. They engage in regular group cognitive behavioral therapy, but they become very aware of why things that they're thinking are happening that way, and they share them within groups. And so what it's essentially made these males able to do is to regulate their thinking patterns and in turn regulate their behavior in risky situations. It caused a 50% reduction in violent crime among males who participated in the program compared to the control group. It caused a 20% increase in graduation among these are extremely high-risk African-American males. The average GPA is 1.5. They had 20% chronic absence from school. These are the males that are doing the worst, that have low probabilities of graduating. And they get a 50% reduction in violent and 20% graduation increase. They got about almost a grade point improvement in grades. So, and the active ingredient, they say, is we're engaging their identity around this belonging thing, but the reality is we're getting them to understand how to control their thinking patterns. Nobody gets taught that stuff. Adults don't get taught that stuff. This stuff needs to be more actively part of the curriculum in schools in terms of teaching folks that, the thoughts that come into your head aren't inherently you. There's a great book called You Are Not Your Brain. And it's basically saying that the thoughts that are coming in your head are not you. You have the ability to regulate those thoughts through metacognitive approaches. We all need these skills, and kids need these more than ever because socio-emotional skills, social skills, are more important to their employment prospects than they've ever been. Just getting the master's degree is not enough for them to stay thriving, especially if they have a background of adversity. Making it to the top, my colleague, she went to Harvard as an undergrad. She has a master's degree from Stanford and a law degree from Stanford and a master's degree from Berkeley. And she's like, my thoughts are running amok based upon stuff that happened to me when I was 7. I'm smart as I can be. I'm very accomplished, but she's a wreck because of trauma. And so she has to manage those traumas. We all have this same reality, and we're leaving kids to their own devices to figure that out. Wait till they're 25 and 30 before, like we figured it out. And that's a problem in this era. Identity development, kids' self-concept, what are referred to as mindsets, is a very important area of intervention, where we're changing kids' perception of their skill set by changing their perception of how they can learn in their brain. Mindsets are based upon the idea that if you teach a child that their brain is like a muscle, and it develops with more practice and more exercise, then failure is conceived differently. Failure is conceived as a milestone to more development. But if they think they can't get any smarter, the brain is not a muscle but a fixed entity, they think that every performance they achieve is a representation of their fundamental intelligence. And it turns out that if you just tell a kid that their brain is a muscle, they start to do better in class. They start to do significantly better, and it's shaping their identity and their self-concept. There's all these kind of psychological interventions embedded, these psychological mechanisms embedded in interventions that are showing us all the types of things that we should be teaching kids outside of the curriculum itself. We should teach them about their minds and how to understand their minds to help them better cope with the adversities they experience in school and particularly outside of school. Meaning making and spiritual development, the reason that's an important dimension of human development is not just because folks emphasize the fact that religiosity or spiritual development are critical to a well-rounded human being, because we confront our mortality and we want us to think about mortality and our connection to a higher power in an important way, but because people who have that connection or have that belief are able to rebound from extreme adversities much faster than other people. So if you live in a neighborhood where 6 of your friends have been murdered in the past 5 years, your religious connection is more likely to is going to make it more likely that you'll still stay in school, given that reality. That you won't lose attachment to these more mundane commitments that you have to make as an adolescent, that you'd probably be less inclined to if you had no connection to religious or spiritual development. So all of these things have implications and matter. Everything that's separated by a comma, as I mentioned, is connected to a study that shows these things matter. But again, we don't track these things. We don't really know what's going on with kids. We know that things need to be developed, but we're not tracking whether we are developing them. And so we leave kids, in many ways, we're blind to what's happening to them, and they go in handicapped into the world to achieve their outcomes. You could think of everything that's here being like a slide on this equalizer diagram. And when things are up at the top, they're a protective factor. And when they're down at the bottom, they're a risk factor. You can put this, what I call a capsule of a human being, or what I call the life course canvas, which is what you see here. I'm going to explain a little bit more of the life course canvas in just a second, but this is the hypothetical you. And as you move across your life course, different aspects of who you are become plastic. They change. So your equalizer configuration when you're 7 could look very different from your equalizer configuration when you're 40. And things that will have happened to you that will move some aspects of you in a protective direction and some aspects of you in a risk direction. And so these are the aspects of you centrally that are going to contribute to your life course outcome, but that are crucially interacting with the ecological contextual factors up there. We also know that there are different sensitive periods of development that affect how likely those equalizer slides are to move. So early in life, cognitive development, socio-emotional development, those are actually very plastic and very sensitive to what happens to us in those years. When we get to adolescence, identity development becomes very sensitive. When we step out of our families, we're trying to identify ourselves in terms of our friend networks and less in terms of our parents. Our identity development becomes very important. And negative identity development pathways are a critical risk factor to lead to things like juvenile behavior problems, incarceration, and so forth. And chronic mental health conditions, chronic mental health symptoms don't usually have their onset until adolescence. So several factors about us are extremely sensitive here and extremely sensitive here. Those slides, in other words, start to move in significant measure when they don't at other times. So my colleague and I, on this life course canvas, identified what are the life course milestones that appear from the longitudinal study literature to be most critical milestones from getting from age 0 up to a critical long-term outcome indicator that we define as middle class by 40. Earning stable full-time employment at a middle class earnings level by the time you're 35, 40 years old. What outcomes make it more likely that you'll be on track to that end result, and what outcomes make it likely that you'll be off track? That really reduce the probability that you'll make it to that end result. These are relevant age spans that organize the research literature. Ages 0 to 5, early childhood, 6 to 11, middle childhood, 12 to 18, adolescence, 19 to 25, emerging adulthood, and 26 to 35, early adulthood. And then we have ecological contextual factors up there that we'll look at in just a second. So we looked at a variety of places. Social Genome Project was an inspiration for this work, which does a good job of identifying the most important milestones. But we looked at several longitudinal studies, meta-analyses, other types of ratings done by experts. And here's what we came up with in terms of the critical life course outcomes. Preterm birth, low birth weight is an off-track outcome right out the gate. So when you're born early or you're born underweight, less than normal gestational weight, you are likely to start in a negative trajectory. And evidence shows that low birth weight and preterm birth are predictive of outcomes all the way up into your late 30s and 40s. So it starts a cascade that early. Attends pre-K, doesn't attend pre-K. Secure attachment, insecure attachment. Insecure attachment being the off-track. School ready, cognitive and socio-emotional skills measured in kindergarten, not school ready. Proficient, 4th grade math and reading and socio-emotional skills, not proficient. Proficient, good grades, 8th grade math, English, and both the proficiency on standardized tests in the 8th grade for math and English, as well as your grades in the 8th grade. And then not proficient, fails math or English. Behavioral problems and discipline, particularly antisocial behavior like violence, suspensions, and expulsions. The arrows that are coming out of where these dots are meant to account for a couple different things. Those dots can occur anywhere along that spectrum and have strong predictive power for long-term outcomes. But also, it's meant to account for the fact that these are often processes rather than discrete events, meaning they're chronic things that unfold over time. The chronicity of behavioral problems is the strongest predictor of negative outcomes versus a single disciplinary event. So you want to think about these as the ratcheting up or ratcheting downward in behavior, but as a part of a process and not as a discrete event. Juvenile delinquency, especially violence, arrest, detention, and recidivism. Criminal offending, especially violent arrest, felony conviction, incarceration, and recidivism. School mobility, changing schools more than once or twice in a year. Grade retention, being held back a grade. High school graduation, college and career ready. We've identified college and career ready basically as 8 through G eligible in California. High school dropout. College enrollment, college completion from a 4-year college, college dropout. A post-secondary credential. Disconnected from school and work. This is defined as the population ages 16 to 24 that is neither enrolled in school or employed. Violence victimization or untreated substance abuse or behavioral health problem. Stable housing, housing instability or homelessness. Stable full-time employment, long-term unemployment or underemployment greater than 6 months. Stable full-time employment at 300% federal poverty level. That's our operationalization for middle class by 30 or 40. We've defined it as 300% federal poverty level for convenience at a national level, which translates to roughly about 70K a year, if you want to know what that number is. But obviously that number is going to vary in its middle classness, depending if you're talking about, say, Fresno versus San Francisco or New York or different places. But generally people define middle class as the 3rd and 4th quintile of the income distribution. So if we were to localize it, we would just take the income distribution, identify the 3rd and 4th quintile, and we'd call it that for Fresno County. And we're actually working on this very question as part of an indicators project for Fresno County. So, and then earning below 300% federal poverty level down here. So everything is in green, on track to that long-term outcome. Everything in red is off track. So I wanted to show how quickly, way to think about these green and red dots is that the green dots are what I call positive credentials. They are positive markers that allow future doors to open for you. The red dots are negative credentials. That when you get these, they actually cause doors to close. And the ultimate off-track negative credential is a felony conviction. A felony conviction is kind of the reverse in being off-track in terms of negativeness that a college degree is in being on track or positive. They kind of mirror each other, and one is like the gate to opportunity, and the other one is the certainty that you're going to be locked out of it. You can still have marginal chances at a decent life if you have a felony conviction, but it's pretty remote. It's pretty limited if you just look at the data. And so these negative credentials are more than just bad outcomes. They actually mark you in ways that will cause an institutional cascade in an increasingly negative direction until you get that felony conviction, and then it's essentially, in many ways, game over for you as an adult. Data has shown, and this all is a causal relationship, has shown that being detained in a juvenile facility increases your probability of adult incarceration by 22 percentage points. That 22 percentage points translates to almost a 250% increase in risk. But 22 percentage points is just so large an effect that I wanted to put up there, just the sheer amount of points that's involved. It increases your probability of high school dropout by 13 percentage points. And then if you drop out of high school, as we saw for African American males on a national level, it increases their probability of going to prison by 47 percentage points. In the state of California, it's 78 percentage points. So you can see, once you get that felony conviction, it's really bad, but it doesn't take much for these negative factors to add up. Once you get on a certain institutional pathway, it's a quick route to that post-secondary credential of being off track, which is a felony conviction. There are other outcomes here that are important off-track outcomes that I didn't add to the first slide. They are less critical than those, but they're nevertheless important, so I wanted to note them. And that's chronic absence from school, teenage fatherhood, even also teenage motherhood, child support in arrears, and gang involvement as critical off-track outcomes that contribute to those other ones that are now in blue. A couple of takeaways from the life course outcome canvas is that earlier outcomes affect later ones. When we start off a negative trajectory, they start to lead to other negative trajectories down the road. And so some folks have rightfully emphasized that we need enormous amounts of early intervention, which is true, but it's not nearly enough. Early intervention does not put us on a positive track and leave us there. It puts us on a better track, but there are so many trap doors in adolescence that you can start on track and quickly fall through one of those trap doors, which some folks have called chutes. The chutes and ladders game is an example. There's so many chutes here in adolescence, particularly if you live in a very disadvantaged environment. You can start in the best track, but if you live in some of the worst neighborhoods, by adolescence, there's going to be a lot of ways that you can find your way to ending up here. And so we have to not only prevent that, but another thing that we need to think about is smoothing the pathways back to being on track. So if you get detained in a juvenile facility, for example, it's extremely hard to get back into school, no matter what county you're in California. It's normal. Principals usually can prevent kids from returning to school. And so this kid is already disengaged for a variety of reasons, and so it's very likely that they bounce around, don't get into school, find an alt school somewhere, stay a little bit and drop out. And so we have to build these pathways as a matter of institutional course, not as individual discretion. We need to build the ladders back to the on track that we don't often have. The last thing are what's referred to causal density. And it's the sheer reality that in real life, everything is related to everything else. The real world cannot be silent, nicely chopped up into I work in early childhood, I work in education, I work in health, I work in criminal justice. That's not how real life works. Unfortunately, that's how our world is organized. But the reality is that all these issues are related to everything else. Every outcome is tied to all these outcomes that preceded it and are happening contemporaneously with it. And so it involves inherently for us to break out of our silos, but it also involves us accounting for, if I want to improve high school graduation, for example, I can't just start in high school. There's no way that high school graduation dropout is going to have a reduction is going to happen if you start with the kids in the 9th grade. They're already on their way. And it turns out that a transitional point that matters the most is as soon as they hit adolescence, as soon as they're 12 years old. When they hit 12 years old, a pattern of stable or decreasing engagement from school has already begun. And if you want to reduce high school dropout, you need to start when kids are in the 6th grade. And so when you think from a life course standpoint, it changes your frame of reference to say, where's the earliest point of intervention that we should actually be thinking about, so that you might have a school that only deals with a program that only deals with middle schoolers, but it's it's a college completion program, for example. Or, because the urgency is to deal with the kids that are going there already, when the reality is you're likely to have much less impact on their likelihood of completing college than you are on a kid who's right now 9 years old, right? So a life course, what it forces us to do is to see the early precursors that have cumulative effects on long-term outcomes. Another critical point is the fact that we need to adopt a 2-generation approach in how we think about this work. Vital statistics data shows that roughly 65% of Black and Latino fathers have their first child before they're 25 years old. 85% have their first child by the time they're 30 years old. They have 2 or fewer kids on average, about 5 years apart. So by the time these males in this generation, in this cohort, are 35 to 36 years old, the next generation of kids are already all here. They're not something that's going to happen later. We often think about generations as like 2 train cars that pass one right after another, when the reality is they're happening in real time simultaneously. What we see here is that adolescent and early adulthood developmental milestones are happening at the same time that early child milestones are happening for their kids. And so helping a father get a post-secondary credential, helping a mother not go to prison, or helping a mother enroll in college, those are all early childhood interventions. Those are in real time impacting the outcomes of their children. But when we think about it, we think about adulthood as something that happens several years from now. Or we think about incarceration as something that might happen to our kids one day versus the fact that it's happening right now and the effect that their fathers are having on them in their early intervention or early childhood programs. So we have to change our frame of reference when we think dual generationally. And what this has led to is a movement across the country to create what are called dual generation programs that tie a shift in an adult outcome to a shift in a child outcome simultaneously. So going back to that child support example, one thing that New York State has done is said that, you know, one of the hardest people to get into early childhood programs are non-custodial fathers. So what they did is that fathers who have child support arrears, they go to the family court judge, there's a list of them. You can find these, they got arrears. And you say, you want to get all these fathers to come participate in a child development program. Well, they'll get parent teaching programs, they'll get child development education, they'll get all these things. But you know what they'll also get? They'll also get legal services, they'll also get employment training, and they will get credit on their child support arrears. We in California have billions of dollars in uncollectible child support arrears, billions of dollars. And we call it uncollectible. We know we're never going to get it. Now that could be a big hole that's empty in a bank account somewhere, or it could be a budget item, meaning we could go to these fathers and use that as a financial incentive. You have $8,000 in child support arrears. I want you to participate in these employment programs, participate in these child development programs, participate in mediation services that we're now going to provide for single-parent families, which is not usually available. It's only available for married, divorcing couples. We're going to add all that stuff into the mix. And so what we want you to do is we want you to apply for a job, and if you at a state level, we have an earned income tax credit, other states do. If you got that, we can help find ways to make you eligible for that. All these types of things that are wedding together a shift in outcomes for the father simultaneously while shifting an outcome for the child. And this is just a paradigm that we should think about every policy, every program strategy we pursue. What is the dual generation implication of this? How can I link this together? And invariably involves both program and policy, meaning public, private, and parent and child simultaneously. And I encourage folks to start to think of that in terms of paradigm, but we're seeing innovations pop up across the country of people who are using that type of approach to figure out how they help break the cycle of intergenerational disadvantage. Because the theory is that if you can help a parent while simultaneously helping a child, you can break the likelihood that that child ends up disadvantaged in adulthood because that parent was disadvantaged in childhood. Essentially, that's what we're trying to break. Ecological contextual factors is the third major building block of the life course framework, and we have them up there in the corner. These things could be thought about as being like an equalizer, but I call it a thermostat because they're the condition. And when they're at the top, they're protective factors. When they're down at the bottom, they're risk factors. Things like family income, education of the parent, neighborhood poverty, community violence, school poverty, and so forth. And across our life, these things change with us. These things go up and down. Turns out most kids, actually I think it's something like 40% of kids are born into poverty because their parents are poor when they're born, but their parents may be in college. It's just that later they move out of poverty. Other kids stay in poverty their entire childhood. So for some kids, their equalizer or their thermostat is moving in a positive direction as they get older as children. Other kids may be moving in a negative direction. Parents get more education, that may move in a positive direction. They may move to a better off neighborhood, and so the poverty they had earlier will decline. So this is a thermostat that changes the pressure and the temperature of the environment as kids move across life. We looked at everything up here is separated by a comma, is related to a study and or studies that says these ecological contextual factors predict life course outcomes. Those dots we looked at. These are predictive of that as well. Race, ethnicity, genetics, parental age at child's birth, documentation status, incarceration of a parent, parental death, parental behavioral health problems, language spoken at home, an additional supportive person, grandparents, aunts, uncles, fictive kin, etc. These are some of the most important family factors as an ecological environment, but so are family resources, parental attention, expectation, and skills, and parental social support, abuse, and neglect. So all these are related to studies. I'm not going to go into all of these, but all of these have some of the strongest relationships. There are other factors, but we settled on these because there's the most robust evidence behind these ones. And many of what are called adverse childhood experiences are in these family factors. Schools and childcare, school systems, discipline practices, resources, peer effects, teacher quality, etc. And then childcare, kin care, center-based childcare, other, are two critical ecological factors that are just beyond the orbit of the family. Peers, mentors, and networks, social and emotional support, mentors, negative peers, and then social capital, bridging and bonding capital, what's called weak and strong ties. Place. We used to say neighborhoods here, but we realized neighborhoods is just the wrong way to frame place for a lot of different issues. And by that, I mean, when we talk about employment and housing markets, those don't happen at a neighborhood level, those happen at a metropolitan level. That's what governs those markets. So you can't really talk about a neighborhood housing market because no market is contained to a single neighborhood, or a neighborhood employment market. Also, violent crime in particular, it turns out, is extremely concentrated. We used to think of violent neighborhoods. We probably still think of violent neighborhoods, but it turns out the vast majority of places and people in neighborhoods are not violent at all. It turns out to be a small number of intersections, street corners, and sometimes individual houses that are driving the vast majority of violence in an entire neighborhood, what are referred to as hot spots. And it turns out if police focus their efforts, going back to the question about how we reduce violent crime, when police focus their enforcement patrol efforts on these places, meaning they post up, they direct patrols there, they reduce violence in those places, they reduce violence across an entire neighborhood. And what they're not doing is arresting people. They're deterring people. They're deterring the commission of violence rather than prosecuting somebody after it's already been committed. And so, I'm deeply involved in the violence prevention world and what strategies work the best there. But overwhelmingly what it involves is that focusing on specific people in specific places at specific times and not treating an entire collective as if it's giving rise to violence. And so when we're talking about violent crime, we don't talk about neighborhood levels. We should talk about specific street segments and intersections and street corners. But when we're talking about the composition of neighbors, then neighborhoods are a good proxy. When we're talking about the amount of poverty among households that surround where you live, it's a good proxy to talk about neighborhoods. When we're talking about the amount of single-parent families, then that's a good proxy. But the important thing is to recognize that, particularly for children, they spend the vast majority of their time as children not at their home. So we define, disadvantaged ecological context by finding a person's home and then drawing a circle around it and calling that their neighborhood. But kids spend the vast majority of their time as children not immediately around their house. They're in school, they hang out in other places, they often hang out in other neighborhoods. A study was done in Los Angeles that followed the routine activity patterns of children, and it found that kids from highly disadvantaged neighborhoods spend the vast majority of their time hanging out in other highly disadvantaged neighborhoods within Los Angeles. Kids from highly affluent neighborhoods do the same thing, but they hang out in other highly affluent neighborhoods in Los Angeles. And so they circuit a Galapagos of neighborhoods, but they completely miss each other across Los Angeles. Now, if we based risk for a kid from a disadvantaged neighborhood on just around their neighborhood, we're forgetting the fact that they're more likely to be shot, shoot somebody, get involved in grievance, beef, do drugs in another neighborhood somewhere else. And so if we treat place just immediately to circle around their neighborhood, we're not taking account of the full impact of place. Place is not just their neighborhood, place is all the places they go locally. And so when you're talking about kids' development, drawing a circle around their house is often not the best way to think about it. Institutions and public systems. Neighborhoods and community institutions, juvenile justice, criminal justice, social health, and human service institutions, all listed here. And by the way, for people who feel like you're never going to see these slides again, I will send these to Hannah, and she will distribute them to everybody so you'll be able to see these slides. And I have citations in the back for many of the things that are cited. And then the last major category is society, culture, and history. Implicit bias, explicit bias, in these various markets: labor market, housing market, retail market, financial market, legal and law enforcement discrimination, educational discrimination, legacy of past forms of discrimination, and then broad macro trends: demographic changes, rise and decline in violent crime, the rise in mass incarceration, the growth in income inequality, the rise in income segregation, the decline in male employment and earnings, and deindustrialization. Political economy shifts, what I refer to as the rise of neoliberalism, which is the overemphasis on market mechanisms to solve our society's problems versus what government used to have a big hand in. And then gender norms, patriarchal forms of masculinity and gender relations that are broadly encompass our society that still matter at a neighborhood level or interpersonal interaction. So in terms of confronting these things broadly and applying the framework, we need to think of ourselves as both people who are trying to change conditions as well as make children adaptive to conditions that they exist in, meaning we're trying to change conditions through policy and system change, but we're at the same time trying to rebuild resilience for young people to conditions that aren't going to change for a generation. We can't tell kids who are negatively affected by mass incarceration, give us 25 years, we'll get back to you on this. We have to build their resilience to the fact that they have incarcerated fathers now, that they have schools filled with children of incarcerated fathers now. It turns out that when the amount of children with incarcerated fathers hits a certain threshold in schools, every kid in the school starts doing bad academically, not just the kids with incarcerated dads. There's spillover effects of all these patterns that we're seeing play out, particularly in schools. So we have to change conditions, but in the interim, build resilience. And so we need programs, services, and practices to help do that. We can't be on either side of the policy program divide. We have to be both, and we're going to confront these realities. So the takeaways I want to leave you with are we have to adopt a life course approach in our thinking. So early predicts causes later. So often we need to go earlier than we think we need to do in order to affect the outcome target that we're trying to affect. Intervention is necessary across the life course. Early intervention is critical, but it's not sufficient. And multiple simulations that have tried to put kids on track early in life and see what their prospects are find that it only gets them so far. It only gets them up through adolescence before negative things take over. Timing matters. When we intervene is critical. So early childhood and adolescence are the two most important milestones, age spans to intervene, but we need interventions, particularly in emerging adulthood as well. History matters. Legacy of past inequalities continue to shape current realities. Agency matters. This is an important point that I actually didn't cover earlier, and that's that a surprising thing happens when you engage kids civically around improving their neighborhoods, for example. Projects have been done, and they have kids identify civic engagement projects that they want to take on. They kind of train them in how to go about it, conduct the research, and the kids go and take to it. Or they get involved in organizing to support a piece of policy, et cetera. Funny thing happens when kids do that. They start to get better grades in school. They start to attend school more often. So when we build on the agency of young people to be agents of influencing the society around them, it starts to spill over in the outcomes that we actually measure them on. And so it's important not to think of young people as just the vessels we're trying to mold, but to also think of them as agents that if we activate them, they can actually achieve some of the benefits, the changes that we're looking for, at the same time getting the benefit in the outcomes that we're trying to improve for them. Equifinality. There are multiple pathways to the same negative outcome, not just one. There are often very few pathways to a positive outcome. Place matters. Race and class matter. Causal density, everything is related to everything else, so it makes siloed approaches ultimately ineffectual. Dual generation, we need to tie changes for the child to changes for the parent and outcomes. Gender specificity, we need to be cognizant of the fact that environments affect boys and girls differently, so often our interventions have to be different for boys and girls to be effective. And then we need to support successful pathways. We not only want prevent kids from going off track, but we need to build ladders back on track. We need to build the pathway back out of juvenile detention into school, or off of several suspensions back into a positive relationship with the school environment. And then we need to balance social control with social support. In my broad view, the pendulum has swung too far from what used to be social support to social control. What I mean by that is we used to help people a lot more back in the day, back in the 50s and 60s. We swung a lot more to punishing people as a way to change their behavior. We took all of the education and the programs out of prisons. They're not corrections anymore. They're just punishment environments. We switched from understanding what's going on with a child and having a relationship to their parent to kicking them out of school. It's a metastasis of a philosophy, of an ideology that swung too far the other direction. At the extremes, too much social support, too much social control are bad. They have perverse outcomes. You give people too much advantages, too much benefit, they start to take advantage of that. But you give people none, and you start to actually produce the thing you're trying to prevent. People are very strong, have a strong belief that incarceration is actually, at the scale that we're doing it, is criminogenic. That we're producing more incarceratees at the scale we're incarcerating people. And so when you swing too far in a punishment direction, you start to have very negative outcomes. We need a better balance of the two things, and this reflects our national politics as well as local politics. And so I have some county metrics to go in. I'm going to send these to you. I don't have time because I want to give you a chance to ask questions. But we look at some of the prospects for poor and middle-class kids to move up the income ladder in this county using data from Rod Chetty on IRS data.